Hey, hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us today for another session of the Colloquium. Today, I have the honor to introduce the brilliant Annie Shattuck. She's associate professor in the Department of Geography. She has been working on critical agrarian studies for many, many years now. She's one of the leading voices in the field. She's part of the editorial collective of the Journal of Peasant Studies, and her work has been fundamental to how we understand pesticides, to the point that the FAO reached out to her and her co-authors about the way in which we are measuring pesticide production, commercialization, and consumption. So please join me today in welcoming Annie Shattuck. Justice too.
Thank you for that lovely introduction, and I will apologize in advance. I'm on like the upswing from 10 days of respiratory disgustingness with a 4-year-old. So if I sound terrible, I am not contagious, and my apologies. James gave me the okay to just do what I've been doing for the last many years here, and I'm just going to give you a kind of overview, a smorgasbord of what I've been working on for the last several years. And I would love some comments because I'm hopefully going on sabbatical next year, and I've been talking to my colleague Marion Werner about maybe turning some of this material into a book, and I have another book project with Diana and some other colleagues that's much more hopeful than this stuff. So I'm trying to think about how to reformulate this and where to go next. Let's just go into it. So the term global pesticide complex was coined by my colleague Ryan Gault at UC Davis to basically identify the interactions between the industry that produces pesticides, how those pesticides are actually used in the real world, how they're regulated, and our kind of changing understandings of toxicity. And all of those elements have undergone a pretty dramatic shift in the last 15 to 20 years. And I started getting curious about that, not from this big picture, but from a very small one that looked like this. I took this picture in northeastern Laos, in a part of the country where 10 years before I took it, there had been close to zero pesticide use. Herbicides were getting mixed directly in stream beds. This was some atrazine. They were getting sprayed by crews of mostly adolescents that were mostly indigenous, newly landless young men. The slope that they're on had been upland rice, forest, and fallow in the very recent past. It allowed farmers to expand their land area 3 or 4 times, and in doing so, cash in on a boom in demand for maize that was destined to feedlots in Vietnam and Thailand. And when that boom went bust, farmers were barely breaking even. They couldn't have done it without cheap generic herbicides that were mostly traded informally across the border. And you can see how intense the weed pressure is here in this field, right? Maize in this landscape is not really possible without herbicides, and it's not possible if they're not cheap. This was a training that was done by a community organization where they asked middle schoolers an hour up a dirt road from a 3-street town to map all the impacts on the body that they had witnessed from pesticides in their community. And they were pretty good trainers about pesticide hazards. We did some biomonitoring in this community with a team from Thai NGO, and 30 to 50% of the kids in these communities that we tested had unsafe levels of cholinesterase inhibition, which also indicates a dangerous level of exposure to insecticides. Again, in this community, there was basically zero pesticide use 10 years prior. At the time, Laos had recorded a 3,600% increase in pesticide use, at least on paper, at least legally. A lot of it looked like this. And I started to wonder if what I was seeing was happening elsewhere. It turns out, yep. And I connected with Dr. Marion Werner at SUNY Buffalo, and she was seeing really similar things happening in the Dominican Republic. She had started digging too. And the story of what's happening and why I was seeing what I was seeing became this project with what we call the Pesticide Trade Data Lab with Marion, Ryan Gault, who I mentioned, Becky Mansfield at Ohio State, and Dr. Christian Berndt at University of Zurich, and then some grad students that all ended up being postdocs. Zachary was here at informatics and is now at UC Davis. Caitlin was at Buffalo and is now a postdoc here with me, and Finn at the University of Zurich. So absolutely everything I'm about to say is not just me, right? It is this entire crew. indicated at the bottom. So what I was seeing in Laos and what Marion was seeing in the DR, and apologies to my geography colleagues who've seen the first half of this talk, go to space out, do your email, come back. As part of a much longer term trend, the release of synthetic chemicals into the environment writ large, right, of which pesticides make up the biggest fraction, has changed faster since 1970 than any other agent of global environmental change, right? Faster proportionally than greenhouse gas emissions, faster than fertilizer, faster than population, faster than land use change. And I'll get to it in a minute, but this graph is an underestimate from 2017. Agrochemicals are ubiquitous. This recent analysis found that 64% of agricultural land is at risk of pesticide pollution by more than one active ingredient, 31% at high risk. This is also an underestimate. I will tell you why. In 2022, for the first time, the Convention on Biological Diversity adopted the Kunming-Montreal Global Framework, which included a quantitative commitment to reduce pesticide use by 50% by 2030. To do that, we'd actually have to know how much was out there. Right? We'd have to actually know if we were going to have a quantitative reduction. We'd have to know what that is. And it turns out we don't. So all the risk assessments use stats from the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, lovingly called the FAO. They're the only publicly available source. There's industry data, which I'll talk about too. And when Marion and I went to see if what we were witnessing on the ground was showing up there, we didn't find anything. And this is what their global pesticide use data looked like in 2022. It was like, great, we're leveling off, wonderful. Agriculture is getting more efficient. It is getting greener. Trouble is that just isn't true. So a little overview of where I'm going. I'm going to talk a bit about how you measure a boom in pesticide use, right, in a notoriously opaque industry. I'm going to talk about the sort of new economic geography of the industry, what we call the generics revolution, from a paper that is in press. I'm going to talk a little bit about the drivers of that pesticide boom in terms of social and agrarian change, not just on the industry or on the demand side. And then I'm going to bring it home a little bit and talk about what those changing dynamics look like when it comes to the United States by talking about paraquat, which you may have heard of. It's a subject of over 4,000 lawsuits in US courts for its connection to Parkinson's, maybe. So first, we needed to know how much pesticide is actually out there and like what the trend line looks like. And it took us about 2.5 years to do that. The great pandemic project, by the way, because it didn't go anywhere. Lost spreadsheets. The UN FAO has sent surveys to governments every single year since 1990 to collect this data. They aggregate it, they make it publicly available. And all of those estimates of pesticide pollution that I just cited in the beginning use this. When countries don't complete, so if Carl is Brazil and I send a survey to Carl and Carl doesn't answer it, right, which Brazil didn't for a very long time, they would just linear interpolate the data. Makes sense. If Carl didn't answer for a decade, right, that linear interpolation makes it look flat, right? Because there's no end on that tail. And you would get these repeat values in the data set. And it turns out in the middle of some of those old data too, there were just a whole bunch of repeat values. So we were able to say, okay, if there's a repeat value, this is a null, right? Nobody said anything, there was no new data. And we measured the repeat values and this graph shows it by sort of country income class. And right around 2010, we start to get an uptake in that no reports by every country income class, high income countries too, but especially lower income countries. So we tried to use trade data to triangulate some of this. And before I go any further, this may be vocabulary that y'all don't need, but I'm just going to do it. Formulated product, active ingredient. Formulated product, Roundup. Comes in a bottle, ready to go out on the field, ready to spray. Active ingredient for Roundup, glyphosate, right? That's the technical ingredient. And then you mix it with a bunch of surfactants, adjuvants, stabilizers, the things that make it spray, stick, stabilize, act more effectively, right? So this is a representation of the commodity chain for pesticides, and it shows the two main public data sources the FAO stat, which is about use from those surveys, and Comtrade, which tracks trade in just the formulated product. So just what you like sell to the end consumer, not the technical ingredient. And trade can happen along any portion of this commodity chain. So if we're talking glyphosate, it's like mining the rock phosphate, synthesizing active ingredient, mixing it up to formulated product. Things are shipped across borders, actual end use. It can happen many times in here. And the geography of this chain has restructured pretty dramatically in the last 20 years. And that's really heated up in the mid 2000s, right? Right when those null values really started to come together. So when we put these two data sets side by side, we noticed some really basic patterns, which was from like 1995 to 2010. Comtrade and FAO stat, so the trade data and the use data said pretty close to the same thing, right? If you don't have an industry, what you are importing minus what you export back out is what you use, right? Very logical. But starting in 2010, there was a pretty big divergence among some of those statistics, shockingly. So we use the trade data to fill in missing values. That has its own problems. Not everybody's a good trade reporter. Trade statistics are reported twice. So if Gustavo is Laos and James is Vietnam, right? Gustavo, you just may not have that great a record keeping. And we may be able to add up what you bring in by totaling Vietnam, China, Thailand, et cetera. We call that the mirror data. And so we used to decide whether we're going to use mirror data or the self-reported statistics, we used an index of reporter reliability from an economic research institute in France that said, how accurate are all of your national trade statistics reporting? And this is a good example of what our method looks like for Laos. Laos, it turns out, is a pretty crappy reporter in general, shockingly. This bottom line is what they were reporting to the FAO. They weren't reporting very often. What they were reporting wasn't great. If we add up China plus Thailand plus Vietnam, et cetera, all of their trade partners, what they said they sent to Laos, we get a very different picture, right? And again, this is just what goes over legally. In my work there, government officials I interviewed estimated that anywhere between 40 and 60% of the trade probably was never recorded and was illegal. So this is kind of why our data varied so dramatically from the FAO's, and we replaced 102 countries worth of data using this method. This is an example from Senegal, sort of the best we could do for countries that did have an industry, right? Like data's bad, our data's still bad. Right? Data's bad, our data's still bad. Senegal was occasionally a net exporter of pesticide up until about 2010, and their largest producer reduced their production 80% because of regulatory issues, and also it was just cheaper to import it from China. This was pretty common around that time, so we replaced all the data that they gave to the FAO with trade data from 2012 onwards, but this is also likely a pretty significant underestimate because that plant didn't shut down, right? So there was still some domestic production happening. We just don't really know how much. So now that we have better data, what do we actually see? Shockingly, pesticide use is not plateauing globally. It continues to increase in a more or less linear fashion. Our data found that it was up 20% by volume over the most recent decade that it was available. Our data is in blue, the FAO's was in red. Hold this thought on China. You can see that big tail coming down. In 2015, the Chinese state put in a 0 increase in pesticide use policy and clamped down on a whole bunch of their smaller scale chemical producers. Yeah, I think that this trend is very real. The actual volumes, unclear. So what does this actually mean? If we break it down, sort of country income class, which have its problems, these changes were largely happening in lower income countries, in countries we often think of as having peasant agriculture, a lot of people involved in agricultural labor, and agricultural sectors that are less capitalized, right? And we saw that jump happen in like 2008, 2009. It's really this inflection point. Global food prices, run up in commodity prices, where the global land grab starts, or what Jason Moore says is the end of cheap food. And if we throw this on a map, we see a few things, right? Lower and lower middle income countries are increasing pesticide use faster than the average in the vast majority of cases. Here, anything teal to blue. We have a pretty high degree of certainty about these increases for places like Laos, Myanmar, Burkina Faso, Nepal, places with domestic industry. They are happening in countries with large-scale agriculture, right, where we'd expect it. Brazil, Argentina, they're happening in places where smallholder production predominates. Nepal, Burkina. There's relatively few places pesticide use actually decreased in the last decade. And some of those data are real suspect. So Thailand is one. Their reporting was super variable. They have a really strong domestic industry. They do active ingredient production in Thailand. By 2013, Thailand was reporting that it used only 13% of what it imported, as if none of its industry contributed at all. But like its data is obviously bullshit. But we couldn't replace it. We have nothing better to replace it with, right? We have no idea what the contribution of domestic industry is, and anecdotally, it's really high. Malaysia and Indonesia, the same. India's super questionable data. One analysis from some agricultural economists found that herbicide use tripled between 2006 and 2016. And the data the government reported to the FAO says it increased 32%, right? And if the government doesn't keep track, the industry hasn't changed a lot. There's very little transparency in terms of what products are going into fields and into bodies. Why? Right. And for one, okay, great. Pesticides have gotten a lot cheaper in most of the world over the last 15 to 20 years because of a really radical shift to generics. And a generic pesticide can be an order of magnitude cheaper than its patented counterpart. So for a very long time, trade value in pesticides was a pretty good proxy for what's being used in the world. Okay. Value of the trade, up, pesticide use, up. That relationship between value and volume pretty well collapsed about a decade ago. Volume was way up, value's flat. So why? First, bringing a new agrochemical to market is super expensive, and getting more so. It takes somewhere in the ballpark of $286 million to bring a new active ingredient to market. That's largely due to regulatory demands in the EU. There's very few companies actually have the budgets to sustain this kind of R&D cost. And those that do shifted their R&D to seeds and genetic traits, right? Biotech is super cheap compared to this. And so you can engineer a seed to be resistant to glyphosate, dicamba, and 2,4-D, and then sell your proprietary formulation that goes with that seed for a tiny fraction of the cost and extend the life of your agrochemical business without this kind of upfront cost. And as public funding has decreased relative to private agricultural research funding over the last 60 years, there's been very little R&D to fill this gap. Another reason is because the low-hanging fruit has already been picked in terms of agrochemical R&D. The stuff that was easy to figure out has been figured out to a certain degree. So between 2000 and 2012, the number of active ingredients fell by half that were under development. And in the meantime, patents expired for the world's most popular pesticides. In 1998, generics were about 35% of the global market. By 2021, generic products had a global market share of 77%, 92% if you include proprietary off-patent sales. And this is when a company that held the composition of matter patent still has a greater than 90% market share due to process, formulation, or other intermediaries. So like Monsanto's patent on glyphosate expired in 1971, but they patented the most useful common form, which of this glyphosate salt. So they were actually able to extend their near monopoly into the early 2000s. So what happened as patents expired on the world's most popular agrochemicals is this new generation of companies that was outside the orbit of the big multinationals sprung up to take advantage of really lower barriers to entry. Trading firms that might have just done distribution for the big guys we're able to just import active ingredient from China, do some formulation locally, which still takes a fair amount of upfront investment, put their labels on it and send it out, but at a fraction of the cost. And this is what that looks like when those bottles arrive in Laos. Thai off-brand glyphosate, Vietnamese off-brand glyphosate, Vietnamese off-brand paraquat. These are pretty cheap. So thanks to support from the US National Science Foundation and the Swiss National Science Foundation, our team was able to buy a bunch of proprietary market research data, which is what the US EPA does when they want to know about the industry. It's what the industry uses in trade press and publications to refer to. And you can see in this visualization, anything in blue was under patent as of 2024, as of last year, in terms of the top products in the top markets in each part of the world. Generics absolutely dominate. And if anybody's a sort of nerd for pesticides, I would love to make a different graph of this that has the date that each one of these were first commercialized. It's dominated by pretty old products for the vast majority of the global market. Exports from China have become so dominant, they actually wiped out entire national industries. This is a sort of map that looks at the total volume that were imported to a region that's attributable to each given exporter. South Africa's pesticide industry basically crashed with the birth of the Chinese pesticide industry. China was pretty much a regional player 20 years ago. They did about 15% of global trade volume. Half of that stayed in Asia. As of 2023, China exported 46% of global trade volume in pesticides, 30% of that to Latin America, 24% to Africa. And their share of the sort of traded net weight and value increased significantly. Interestingly, they do only about 21% of the global value of the pesticide trade are their exports, right? So again, rise of generics in China. In smaller markets, these guys play a really outsized role. Vietnam imports about half their pesticides from the Chinese. About 2/3 of Ethiopia's pesticides come from the Chinese. 15 years ago, less than 10% did. Pesticides are basically now a South-South trade, even if many of the biggest companies are headquartered in the global north still. As of 2 years ago, India just surpassed the US as the number 2 exporter by value after China. So of the 527 plants in the world that produce active ingredients for pesticides, the vast majority are concentrated in China. Each of these plants will produce between 1 and 40-ish substances on site. They may produce other chemicals. This is a sort of a big split in terms of, I didn't put the maps up, but the US, much more important for herbicide production, India, much more important for insecticide production, Colombia and South Korea, fungicides. There's a sort of geographical division of labor in terms of what types of products are produced where. As recently as 2010, there were only 3 generics firms that had sales of over $1 billion. The largest is what is now called Adama, which is part of the ChemChina group, Syngenta group. And by 2021, there were $7 billion companies. India and China dominate the landscape of this. Alba is a US company, but it has a 20% minority stake owned by a Chinese company. New Farms, Australian, UPL's, India, and the rest are Chinese. Yangnong and Adama are both part of the ChemChina Syngenta group, now the world's largest firm. Okay, I'm going to get really boring for just a minute. I know I'm already putting Carl to sleep. He's going to hang out with me. He's going to do it.
Bill's with you.
Yeah. So this is not to say that the big guys that are always getting harped on, right? The Bayers and Corteva in our wonderful state, that these guys are not important. By 2 years ago, at least, the top 4 legacy firms, which is the Syngenta group, which is now owned by ChemChina. When ChemChina and Sinochem merged, they also purchased Adama. They purchased Syngenta as the world's largest chemical company. Bayer, which acquired Monsanto, BASF, and Corteva, which was a merger of Dow and DuPont. Those guys still accounted for 65% of all market sales. if you pull Adama out of Syngenta's contribution because of the way they do corporate accounting and the industry tracks it. They just do a whole lot of subcontracting in the manufacturing, right? We shouldn't be that shocked that this is happening in the pesticide sector. It's happened in every other part of the global economy. So there's this sort of emerging bifurcated structure. We have dominance of companies based in the global north. They do maintain vertically integrated production for some chemistries that are off patent, and then they basically outsource production for a lot of other things with growing involvement of generics in China. So Bayer is a good example. They still do almost 40% of glyphosate sales. They have 4 production sites, Belgium, US, Malaysia, and Argentina. Of all of the production sites for glyphosate, there's 39 are in China and 9 are in India, right? There's just been this big shift in the volume of that production towards the global south. Many of those are owned by smaller companies, and those smaller companies contract to these big guys who then use them in their production networks. And the Chinese industry has gone through a revolution too. Rainbow was the 12th largest pesticide producer in 2021. In 2015, it wasn't even in the top 35. The growth has been absolutely dramatic. As of a couple years ago, 29 of the top 50 firms in terms of sales value were in mainland China. Throughout the 2010s, the direct active ingredient exports, right, which that's where you sell it so that it can be formulated somewhere else, was still almost 60% in volume. So China's been trying really hard to get these guys to upgrade, right, and sell formulated products at a higher value rather than just a sort of raw technical ingredient. And that's only been marginally successful, right? But when you've got this much dynamism in the industry, this much change in firms, this much investment, and a huge amount of generics production going through the world really, really cheap, that tells us a little bit about why we've had this big boom from the supply side. Great. Coming back. Great. So quick summary. Making new AI, really expensive. We get a lot more investment in biotech instead of AI. That the geography of the production shifts, the geography of the intellectual property landscape shifts. We get a lot more domestic formulation, everything gets cheaper. Everything gets cheaper, it can go out in the world in places that it couldn't go for. Things were happening on the demand side too, and I'm just gonna hit this really fast, where broad agrarian transformations made it more likely that people would reach to pesticides as a solution. So rising rural to urban migration, right? Rising labor scarcity. If you could formerly pay people to weed by hand, you've got more expensive labor. You got Gustavo's looking at me like, this is just, yep, great, got it, yep. Good, right? Basic economics. You got rising rural wage rates, rising migration is generally correlated with higher pesticide use. We've got big crop booms, higher global commodity prices since the 2008 financial crisis. We've got a big shift from subsistence to cash crops in many of those low-income countries that I was talking about in the beginning, like Laos, like Myanmar. Massive climate variability, which I don't have time to talk about. Changes in supply chains for consumers, supermarketization in middle-income countries and lower middle-income countries. If you are a supplier for supermarket chains that supply domestically, like Walmart Nicaragua, you're gonna have cosmetic standards. You may or may not have minimum residue level testing, right? So if you are gonna meet those contracts, you have to make your produce pretty, right? The MRL testing for exports is generally more stringent than for domestic markets. And there's been a fair amount of research looking at what's consumed domestically within Thailand, for example, has much higher residue levels than what goes out of Thailand. My colleague Ryan Galt found the same thing in Costa Rica. Unfamiliar crops, right? So massive amounts of agrarian change since 2008 with the global financial crisis, the global food crisis, and rising migration. And essentially pesticides fulfill a social function, right? Pesticides help mitigate risk. They help make up for scarce labor. They do risk management in the absence of actual insurance. It's a pretty poor substitute. It makes it possible to do novel export crops. If you don't know what is going on out there in the field, right, and you are nervous about it and about to lose your investment, right, pesticides are a pretty decent substitute for knowledge. They're extension, right, practice, inherited knowledge. They play this social function in a world that's really changing, right? And so those social changes hit at the same moment that the generics revolution hit. And if anyone wants to talk about that for a long time, I can. My colleague, Annie Shattuck, I think, come back with that delay. Really well when he called agrochemicals a medicine for both crops and changing agrarian relations and the conditions of cultivation. And if sort of going back to Laos, this is exactly what I was seeing in the hills in Laos, where people had depended on cash for a very long time, where the previous methods of getting cash, non-timber forest products, high-value timber, had been logged out, over-collected, gone, where the land frontier was closing, and maize was essentially the only way that you were going to get cash to get a motorbike, put a new roof on your house, pay some medical bills, or do any other of the sort of modest aspirations that people had. And herbicides made that possible, and specifically how cheap those herbicides were made that possible because the margins were so wildly thin. So what does this look like when it comes home to the United States? I've been working on this with my colleague, Caitlin Sears, who's a postdoc here, and she is leading a paper that we are really hoping to have a full draft of in the next few weeks, on where we call paraquat booms in the US and banned in China. That is the title of the paper. We have decided we aren't going to beat around the bush. So not beat around the bush with this one. It's a really good case for thinking about some of the implications of these geographic shifts. How many of you remember campaigns around the circle of poison that started in the 80s? Yeah, thank you. A couple people, right? So big activist discourse in the 80s that has never actually died, right? Was that the US banned pesticides here, but we shipped them abroad to be used and to poison other people elsewhere. And then sometimes those would return to us as residues on our imported produce, right? And that was the framework that was used for a lot of pesticide activism. It has some problems. It was never exactly that simple. People are still using it. There was a film made a couple years ago in Switzerland of this title. It's only one sort of window on it. But the landscape of regulation doesn't look that way anymore either. So this is from a paper last year, colleagues mapping bans of paraquat around the world. Paraquat has now been banned in 67 countries. If you don't know what it is, it's a non-selective herbicide. It is so acutely toxic that a teaspoon could kill me. I'm not a small person. It's used in rural suicides often. And this is one of the primary reasons it's been banned. It is implicated in a whole lot of workplace accidents. People where I was working, there were stories about when people died of pesticide poisoning, it was usually paraquat. Somebody would be like clearing a line of their sprayer with their mouth, and that was enough. It's used in domestic violence cases. It's pretty nasty stuff. So it's for its acute toxicity, right? Not its long-term stuff, not the reason it's been in the US courts, that it's been banned mostly in this geography. If we look at this like all of West Africa, one would not imagine sitting in the United States that all of West Africa has a more stringent regulatory framework than the United States when it comes to pesticide. You would be wrong. Most of Southeast Asia, whether those are effective, much of the pesticides across the border illegally is a whole nother story. The geography of paraquat production has shifted pretty dramatically too. You can see it's highly concentrated in mainland China. Of all the places where it's manufactured, only India, Indonesia, and Colombia is it legal. Again, this is from private industry data our team was able to purchase with an academic license. Paraquat was originally produced in Switzerland. We used to produce it in the United States up until about 20 years ago. This shift has been relatively recent. The US is one of the major global market destinations for paraquat. The USGS ePest database, which thanks to the Biden administration, not even Trump, the Biden administration, were no longer connecting data for. Their most recent estimate was 2018. They showed a near doubling of pesticide use in the most recent 10 years of data. And like, remember a few slides ago, declining innovation in new AIs. Not a lot in agrochemical alternatives. I think the last count was something in like 2% of USDA research budget went to organics, and we're not even talking about research budgets today. This is another result of that, right? Reaching back in time to more acutely toxic agrochemicals that had largely fallen off the map and have come back to repair the damage from agrochemical overuse in other AIs. So if you have glyphosate-resistant Palmer amaranth in your field, you are going to use paraquat as a burn-down herbicide, right? You are going to come through and use that to clean your fields. Paraquat is now increasingly used as a desiccant for soybeans, right? So if you have erratic weather around harvest time, which we all do now, you can just hit the field with paraquat, burn it down, and know that you're going to be able to harvest 10 days later. And the part of this boom in soybeans is variety for the Mid-South, including Indiana, that is designed to be indeterminate, so you can hit it with a desiccant and get it in. James, you're looking at me like you love this part of this talk.
I think it's fascinating. I can geek out.
We boomed, right? Cotton, paraquat's used as a desiccant. Soybeans, paraquat's used as a desiccant. Orchard and grapes. Geographically, where does this look like? Right? Where do we have the most intense paraquat use? Surprise, no. Surprise, not. Mississippi Delta, the Cotton Belt in the Carolinas, the agricultural baskets of California, San Joaquin Valley, Eastern Washington. These are the places where we have, by the way, fairly high agricultural, like labor-intensive agriculture, right? Fairly high exposure to like agricultural workers, orchard and grapes, fruit and vegetable industry, California, Washington, the nursery industry in Florida. Not exactly exciting. And then we've got it in parts of the US that geographer Mark Edelman has called the hollowed out heartland, right? Parts of the United States where we've seen really dramatic land consolidation, where we have seen a sort of hollowing out of small towns and rural businesses. And I would really love if somebody who's really great with stats, and I'm tired of doing math, I'm not good at it, wanted to figure out what the relationship was between paraquat use and land consolidation and the use of desiccants and land consolidation in general, because anecdotally, that would be interesting. I'm out of time. Yeah, so dissertation, have that. So what are the implications? We talk about everything getting greener. We talk about biologicals. We talk a lot about organics. We've had 25 years of movements for sustainable agriculture. The world is rapidly moving in the wrong direction. At best, we're getting cheap bulk agrochemicals for the majority world, and maybe high tech in the core, maybe. Cheaper pesticides play social roles that have been abdicated by other forms of social organization, right? Insurance, knowledge, labor, ecosystem services, things that people in this room might think of as commons, right? As those commons have been eroded. There's a real politics of knowledge around pesticides, right? In terms of measuring them. So our project with the FAO was great. They took some of our methods. They didn't take some other ones because they can't tell Carl, if he's Brazil, that his data is nonsense because he won't participate anymore, right? The FAO is a government agency or an intergovernmental agency. But there's a real politics of knowledge in terms of how do we know what's happening and how do we know what its impacts are and who gets to decide what is enough in terms of defining those impacts. And I would say sort of toxicity for a growing number of people, even perhaps the majority of the world, as Michelle Murphy has said, has become an unavoidable condition of eating, drinking, breathing, working, living, right? If we go back to Laos, who is to blame for the boom in pesticide use? Blaming individual companies or blaming the individual choices of peasant farmers is pretty foolish, in my estimation, right? This is a really systemic problem. It's rooted in the policies that allow agriculture to extract wealth and natural resources from the countryside. It's rooted into the lack of social supports for farmers. It is rooted in the research on agrochemical alternatives or lack thereof. It's rooted in the way supply chains are governed, right? In other words, this is a systems problem. It has its roots in the global pesticide complex. We want to tackle it. I would say banning specific chemicals is not the way to go, but a broader sort of systemic social and ecological shift and a reckoning with all the ways in which people are sort of making life in spite of this. So, talked a little too long, not too bad. Thank you.
Monitor online too, yeah. Maybe any students first, I said.
Maybe. And then Jess. Scott, you do it, but
No, it's all you. I'll just monitor the chat, yeah, just in case folks raise their hand or.
please go.
Thank you very much for this presentation. This is what I love about the workshop. Like, I've never heard anything about this. I'm like a PA, so never heard about pesticide. I think this is very interesting. I guess like as you were talking, my question is like, and this is a hard question, like, what is the suggestion here? It's like when it comes to barriers for entry, I was thinking maybe it's good that you have a barrier for entry because you don't want like new types of pesticides being researched and like put into, like in this way we have a barrier for entry could be something positive, but getting from your presentation, that's not what we want. We want more research in that area. But then how do you decrease that onus of entry in the market? Because you need to like juggle sort of like you need new development of something that is maybe better than what we have currently, but you also have sort of like standards that must be met. So you feel like banning is not the solution. Is the solution like having alternatives and like decreasing barriers for entry for new products? Like, what do you think? What do you make of this?
Well, answer this very carefully. That $286 million to bring a new agrochemical to market, right? The industry has crowed about that, and it has unintended consequences, right? It has had unintended consequences. If we sort of take the flip side of that, like what does it take to actually know what pesticide does in the body? Right? So the first congressional hearing about DDT's impact on human health was in what, 1960? And DDT was banned because of its impact on wildlife, right? Not its impact on people, but in that first congressional hearing, people were worried about the link between DDT and cancer. In 2002, some researchers found an amazingly cool data set, which was hospital records on Long Island and the data from the vector control program. So like in the 50s and 60s, municipalities used to have like little tanks and they used to go down the beaches in Long Island and like literally like put trucks out that would like just literally spray people. And there's amazing archival footage of kids just like running behind the trucks being like, yeah, it's nice and cool. It's humid. This thing is spraying. Great. Get rid of the mosquitoes. So 2002, these researchers be like, oh, cool. We know spatially exactly where these vector control programs were. We have hospital records from here. We're going to look and see if there's an increase in cancer rates between the people who were exposed during this period where we were using DDT for vector control. And they're like, nope, there wasn't. Great. And it was like, by like 2003, if you were a serious researcher of pesticide, you have to be like, yeah, DDT, bad for wildlife, cancer, no problem, right? 2015, Barbara Cohen at UC Berkeley did a very similar thing with a vector control program in Oakland and their hospital records, but she just looked at people who had been exposed, women who had been exposed when they were pregnant right? If they were a fetus in utero, or if they were at the age of menarche, which is the periods for like the critical periods of breast development. And from the animal studies, it looked like DDT was an endocrine disruptor, right, that messed with the hormone cycles. And she found a 400% increase in breast cancer rate if you were exposed during one of those 3 times. So by 2015, we have a sort of nail in the coffin for DDT with cancer. And that was 60 years, 65 years after the first congressional hearing on it, right? So science takes a very long time to figure out what these things are actually doing in the body. And if we think about what overlapping exposures look like the pesticide sprayers that I was working with in Laos would put 4 different kinds of agrochemicals in a steel drum, mix them up, put them out, right? There is absolutely no way to know what those are doing synergistically over time. So on the one hand, that $289 billion or $1 million in like regulatory compliance in some ways isn't enough, right? And in other ways, you're like, well, you're strangling an industry. And there's people who be like, well, maybe that industry should be strangled, right? The point I'm trying to make with that is how little investment there is in a different kind of paradigm, right? Small scale farmers working with each other, sort of farmer to farmer work on agrochemical alternatives. There's tons of promising stuff out there. The return on investment from very conventional USDA funding to very conventional organics, just breeding for organics, astounding. But there has just been so little R&D that is not part of the sort of agrochemical paradigm that it is really hard to say, it's really hard to make comparisons, right? When people say, oh, organic versus conventional, organic out yields, you're like, well, yeah, sure. You've had 70% of the world's, 70 years of the world's entire scientific infrastructure, right? And all of the economy set up behind making that work. Of course it does. If it didn't, come on, sweetheart, we have a massive institutional failure here. So what little we do see in terms of investment in farmer-led approaches to agrochemical alternatives are super promising, right? And I'm much more interested in that. Sorry, that was a very long answer to that question.
Jess. Okay. I found especially compelling how you tied so many different sources of data and uncertainty among those sources of data to a broader systemic story. It's incredibly sort of vivid and compelling. I have 2.5 small questions and 1 larger question that you already started to touch on. Well, has anyone, and this gets to your dissertation proposal idea, but has anyone mapped a portion of agriculture that is farmed by immigrants to whether it's banned or not? So example, right, US relies a lot on immigrant labor for agricultural production. Maybe not terribly surprising. Banned. Right? So that would be, I'd be really curious, right? I'm looking at West Africa. They don't rely a lot on immigrant labor, right?
Yeah.
Also, right? So question there, whether there's a xenophobic, horrible, another horrible. 2, I'm curious about fungibility of the capital involved here. So like the plants that can produce the AIs, or even the final product. Can those, like, in a better world, how could, are those plants that could be repurposed? So I'm thinking, like, oddly, what struck me was like, well, India has the Serum Institute, right? They produce a ton of vaccines. Like, is there any world in which the capital currently tied up in plants for producing pesticides could what's the fungibility there? You know anything about that? I'd be curious. That's the last smaller question ties to the larger question is sort of green demand marketing, culture of demanding organics or at least pesticide free. So I'd be curious if sort of inflation or other broad systemic approach, trends have changed or decreased consumer demand in this regard for more organic alternatives and therefore limited investment and development of those solutions. We saw this in the timber industry where people just cared less about FSC, especially after 2008, 2009, when it was like all of a sudden you couldn't really support it, you could sustain, right? Okay. So that's the broader, so that leads to the broader question about how we think about trade-offs here when there's so much uncertainty. Right? Like, I worked picking grapes in Eastern Washington where you're pointed out, and I was like, oh, wow, okay. But the challenge there was, okay, well, if we have pesticide lots of we have sort of organic parts of land. We're obviously going to keep those up. We're going to market them differently. But just so you know, the organic plots of land consume far more energy, put far more pollutants into the air from having to run the tractor a bunch more times that we didn't have to do, and the sides we did. So from a small business perspective, they were even thinking about the environmental trade-offs, right? In light of uncertainty around what the long-term consequences are, how can we think about the fact that there will be trade-offs, and we yet, as at the moment, don't really know what's on either side of those? But maybe you do, and maybe
Nobody knows, right? That's part of the trick. And so your first question about what's the market for organics done with inflation, I don't know the answer to that in the United States. I am frankly much more worried about the impact of pesticide residues in food outside of the United States than I am here. So I had a colleague at the Thai Department of Environmental Quality who went and tested like 18-year-olds at a like a not a rural college, but like a state school in northeastern Thailand. About 98% of them had acetylcholinesterase inhibition, which is the biomarker for exposure to organophosphate and carbamates. None of them were agricultural workers. You test the produce in northeastern Thailand, and the organophosphate residues are not what would make it to the United States, right? And my colleague Ryan Galt did the same thing in Costa Rica and found much higher residues on produce destined for domestic markets than what was getting sent out. So like that is a national level experiment all over the world that's happening. And there is no transparency on that. In terms of like what those trade-offs are, yeah, they're trade-offs. And like the organic strawberry growers in California are notorious for hiring Mixteca and indigenous workers because there's so much more stoop labor and the injury rate is so much higher, right? Because you're not using herbicides in a way that is fundamentally racist, right? Where they, so organics, especially in like big commercialized supply chains, right? There's no saints out here, right? There's no saints and there's no easy answers. In terms of how do we know actually what the harms are? Another piece of my research is really trying to interrogate that theoretically. In the part of Laos where I worked, hepatitis B is pretty endemic. Liver disease is really endemic because of a fluke. There's a lot of alcoholism. People were dying of liver disease. People were dying of things that they would just assume were liver disease, that people didn't really, like, wow, nobody really went to a hospital, and so there's no records, there's no health surveillance. And so the question is, how do we actually know, right? How do we know? How do we know what those harms are? My sort of proposition is that at this point, we know enough to say it's worth a whole lot of investment in some alternatives, right? Like we know enough to say it's worth some investment in alternatives. There is not, in my view, a lot of point in being on a data treadmill. Like we could spend $300,000 to do an epidemiological study in upland Laos looking at what the impact of the pesticide boom was, especially on children. It doesn't make any sense to do that, and I would contend it's not even ethical to do that in a place where people can't feed their kids 2 months out of the year. Right? It's not top of the line. It's not. What is top of the line is trying to make sure that we have an agricultural system that doesn't put people in the position of saying, I can go spray for a living and that is the only opportunity I have to make money, right? And I have no access to healthcare. What is worth doing something about is the broader system in which that is imbricated. And I think that's sort of my contention. So I'm happy to talk to you about that more.
There's a few online. We can sprinkle in whenever you want to, Deanna. No, I mean,
Let's go online and then Gustavo.
and we'll save the chat for you as well, because there's a
Sure.
lot of good stuff on there.
Great.
Fernando was asking, he says, thanks for the talk. My question is there any sign that Trump's policy will affect the relocation of the pesticide industry to the US? Will his increase in tariffs affect imports from China? What can you say about the double standard of pesticide use by companies such as Bayer, BASF, and those from China or India?
Good question.
Yeah.
Depends on the active ingredient we're talking about. Like
Yeah.
most of the glyphosate we consume in the United States is produced here, right? The paraquat that we're using is not. So where is that going to shift the balance? I don't know. Like herbicide use trends are driven right now by weed resistance to particular herbicides, right? Farmers don't have a huge amount of choice. So yeah, it'll probably drive up costs for some products.
That's not a bad thing. There was one more too, but we can interject.
Then Gustavo, then we go online, then James.
That's right.
Okay, so well, super fascinating presentation. I really like that you put everything together. We don't know much about this topic. So something I was thinking on the international aspect is that if you go and check the GDP per capita of these countries, Costa Rica, Thailand, whatever, and then you go and see what kind of policies developed countries had when they had that GDP per capita, essentially was more or less the same. So they were allowing this to be used widely, no? So the GDP per capita of Costa Rica now is probably lower than the US in the 50s or in the 40s. At that point, we were allowing kind of almost no regulation, no? So one possible story is, well, these countries essentially face a different trade-off. They are aware of the risk, but they prefer more output and they take the risk, okay? The other possible explanation is something else is going on. The difference between those countries now and the US in the 50s is that now we know that these things generates a lot of health problems. In the 50s, we didn't quite know, so essentially, okay? So, but it looks to me that it's more like the first story, and that's why they are lying in the international statistics. Essentially, they know you are putting me on the very kind of on a very bad spot. So I want to do this, but I look very bad if I report the truth. I want to lie to you, essentially. So do you think that that's what's going on?
Like you're asking me, basically, I think there's an environmental Kuznets curve for pesticides.
Something like that, maybe, no? So it's going on.
There's a paper by a guy, like a Dutch dude and this Thai guy, Schreinemakers and Sibraka, who basically investigated that and found that's not exactly what's happening because the structure of the agricultural economies are different. If we just use, because I have this figure, the geography of paraquat bans. Paraquat was brought up for Rotterdam the last 3 times, once by Malaysia, once by Burkina, and shot down by the US and China. But if we just look at who's actually banned it, this is not an environmental Kuznets curve of who's banning paraquat in terms of GDP or even the importance of agriculture to the economy. And paraquat regulation is not a perfect proxy for environmental regulation of pesticides writ large, right? This is a acutely toxic one, but it's pretty uneven, right? The US and Australia tend to regulate pesticides a lot lighter than the EU, and actually fairly lighter than China in terms of the products that it bans and what it allows. The Chinese have made this very concerted effort because their pesticide use was some of the most intensive in the world up until 2015. And they've made a very strong top-down effort to try to clamp down on that. That's been really geographically uneven within China, but we can talk about that later. So I think it's more complicated than that, right? Costa Rica is never going to become the United States, and neither is Malaysia, right? The sort of geography of industrial restructuring has made that the case, where that transition from agriculture to industrial employment just straight up is not happening in many of these countries. So.
We're gonna go with one online.
Okay.
Yeah, so this is from Caitlin, and she said, Annie, I love the quote that you gave, pesticide is a substitute for knowledge. I see this in Mexico as industrial maize systematically undermines milpa ecologies as a cultural, spiritual, political, and economic framework. I'm curious about how you see pesticide use aligning with racialized histories of land use and of the people turned bodies used to create a productive land. How is pesticide use erasing alternative relationships to land and land as a site of longstanding knowledge production?
Really good question.
Yeah.
Oh. Yeah. And that's what make plantation agriculture possible, right? I mean, ecologically, it does. There's huge parts of, I mean, Doug Murray's book on Nicaragua from the 90s was all about how cotton would not have been possible in huge swaths of Nicaragua ecologically, agronomically, without certain forms of insecticides. So it's like it makes the plantation system possible. If you aren't going to use pesticides, you need a lot more labor. At this point in time, that is just a reality. So part of I would say the upside to the reality that Caitlin is talking about is the history of pesticide regulation is also a history of pesticide activism and among farm workers, right? The first time we had real serious contention around insecticides in California agriculture was United Farm Workers organizing around organophosphate exposures. And people did not believe that the neurological impacts from acute pesticide poisoning from organophosphates in California San Joaquin Valley were actually happening. They blamed it literally on crazy Mexicans. Like it was a very, very explicitly racialized discourse of why those bodies, what was happening to those bodies didn't count and why the experience of migrant farm workers didn't count, right? And it was farm worker organizing that actually prompted the science that made that count. And you see that happening over and over, not just in the United States. Part of the region and some of Caitlin Sears' work talking about the paraquat bans in Malaysia was women, migrant farm workers organizing against paraquat that helped put that on the national agenda. So this isn't just a sort of US story, right? This is happening over and over again all over the world with people who are most effective, who are constantly invisibilized, have been racialized subjects, who have had to organize and work very, very hard to make the impacts to their bodies legible in a way that politics would take seriously and that science.
Yield gap. The whole idea of yield gap is profoundly racialized. Let's go to, oh no, James' question.
Okay, so this is an issue that I've wrestled with from a practitioner point. Is like the debate between the GMOs versus the non-GMOs, because the non-GMO chemicals, the atrazines and these older chemicals to me are much scarier than the newer ones. If I look at health effects, if I look at environmental effects, and look at like life cycle analysis. I mean, can you speak to this at all? 'Cause I mean, I'll say an example is like, we have oats. I can get oats that are non-GMO. However, oftentimes throughout Canada, they'll kill them off at the end so they can harvest them with Roundup. Most of like the non-GMO corn that's grown around here still has atrazine and like all these other chemicals and 2,4-D that are used. So it's like, in the food movement, people are like, oh, give me non-GMO, but I think they equate that with no chemicals, and that's not the case. It's actually far from the case, and they're probably dealing with a deadlier cocktail of poisons than if they took the GM. I don't know. It's like, this is where I'm like at a loss. Because I read, and then I come up with different responses. Please enlighten me.
Just in terms of this story, right? The role of GMO was the role of sort of extending the useful life of older herbicides, right? By making these sort of stacked traits that you could hit a field with, that's resistant to both glyphosate and dicamba, right? So you don't deal with your, 14-foot tall Palmer amaranth, which is we're still failing to do. So in terms of what product has fewer agrochemicals in it, right? It's like Yeah. Right? I don't think there's a way to say non-GMO or GMO is gonna have fewer agrochemicals in the production in US row crop commodity agriculture. There's just no way to read that off of that label. And
Science is there, no?
right, but I mean, like, if we're, okay, are we talking about soybeans in Mississippi? Are we talking about oats up north, right? Are we talking about like the glyphosate tolerances in residues for oats? The EPA has just been lifting them as their use of glyphosate as a desiccant has been extended. They're like, we'll just regulate this. So like, we were concerned, but we'll just regulate the concern out of it. No problem anymore, right? And that is one way that governments have been trying to deal with this too. My colleague Soleil's Castro in Costa Rica has been working on the same thing, like big struggles within Costa Rica to just be like, oh, well, we can't actually agronomically do this and make money in the same plantation form. So we'll just get the government to say that these MRLs are fine. And some of that's happened here. Just like, okay, GMO, non-GMO, I know that there's some really good arguments for erosion control with that. I think part of what we're seeing with this boom in paraquat use, right, is resistance to other herbicide, and it's already happening to paraquat too. Right, it's already happening to paraquat too. It's going to continue to happen. Evolution's amazing, right? Palmer amaranth is amazing. It's going to go, right? So this is a temporary Band-Aid on a really systemic problem that you are deeply aware of, right? Where there's just not a lot of really great options out there to make the same kind of money in a system with really tight margins.
Yeah, I mean,
I don't need to tell you that, James Farmer.
I refuse to spray my fields.
Yeah.
I absolutely refuse to spray my fields, and I can deal with weeds.
Yeah.
I mean, that's it. I'll manage them, mowing, I'll manage them with, grazing, but I won't spray the fields.
And, in some ways, that's where we're gonna have to go because all of these AIs are losing their effectiveness. And the cocktails of AIs we're putting out there can only last so long. It's not great. I would wish that would go sooner, right? I wish that would go sooner before people are doing paraquat, dicamba, 2,4-D, glyphosate all at one time, right? And that's expensive.
Thank you.
I'm so hopeful from you, Annie Shattuck. I don't know who you now. Maybe we take one online and then agent.
Sure, that's absolutely
There's
fine.
another one?
Yeah, there's a bit of an open-ended one, Annie. So
Sure.
Fernando was asking about if you could reflect on the double standard of pesticides and regulations, for example, China banning paraquat for internal uses, but allowing export, in Europe as well to the global south. So I guess you could take that in a more normative international direction, or you could take it, I guess, more CSR and ethical, whatever you're kind of.
I think China had good reasons to ban paraquat
Mhm.
within their own borders.
Mhm.
Right? I think, you're now learning the law is only good as our ability to enforce it, right? Both as a public and as institutions. And the dramatic changes within China and their industry, there was a lot of forcible shutting down of small scale chemical companies, right? You piss off a whole section of your capitalists, that has a legitimacy problem. You can only change so much so fast. So I would say regulation within China, also not perfect, right? But moving in a certain direction towards more stringent regulation of pesticides because it's created a lot of internal problems that the government has recognized. In the United States, if we're just talking about the case of paraquat, the lawsuits that are in US courts around the connection to Parkinson's, I mean, I'm not an epidemiologist. My understanding of that is you could probably be a really honest scientist and come down either way. A lot of the papers that came out in discovery in those lawsuits are fairly damning about what Syngenta thought might be possible as early as the 1960s. Those are unresolved. But if we're talking about who is being damaged by paraquat in the United States, right, the highest intensity paraquat use per acre in California is in Kern County. That is one of the most profoundly unequal counties in the state. It's one of the highest agricultural labor, lots and lots and lots of migrant workers, lots of undocumented folks, lots of history with violence and policing, right? If we're talking about a place where you have the majority of people are affected that are politically marginalized, it would be Kern County, right? If you look at the Mississippi Delta, right, or the Cotton Belt in the Carolinas, right, we also have places that have been basically abandoned by the state. We've had a lot of rural abandonment in the United States in these places where we're having those. So is paraquat creating a problem in the United States? It's not creating a problem until someone has made it a problem. Okay? And it is a lot, it has been increasing in places that our country is more inclined to not look too hard at. Yes.
Thank you so much. I'm just like with others, just super fascinated with the way you kind of connect super hard data with like a wonderful narrative. I have like a part question and part comment. I was wondering like if you could help me think about the system, because this is a systemic problem, right? That how like Green Revolution was kind of part of the infrastructure that put together this system.
Yeah.
And then in 1980s, in many places like those global economic policies with structural adjustment and kind of opening up the market towards international companies, enabled the flow of these poisons all over. And then the part comment is that like it's just so fascinating that in early 2000 and 2020, like some of these products were being used to kind of make DIY bombs for like domestic terrorism in Pakistan. So it's like if you ever thought of other geographies of harm and use that it kind of bled into instead of like just through food space and agriculture. Yeah.
I don't know enough on that question. We go back to this guy. Like part of the history of the Green Revolution is the history of sort of import substitution industrialization and the sort of national supports for fertilizer and pesticide industries. And like the example of South Africa is one where that was absolutely the case there, right? Protected market, really big regional player. Liberalization happened, goodbye South African industry. The same thing happened for South Africa's pharmaceutical industry over the same period. So yes, some of this is basically just the same old story, just for agrochemicals. And then some of it is like India has become a major player globally and had a whole lot of state backing in the very beginning, and has turned that into, as India has liberalized, becoming a major global player. So it's not a one-to-one. A lot of countries have really specialized too. So Malaysia was a really strong, and this is from Caitlin Sears' work. You can see in this map was a strong regional player in the 90s, and they've become much less so, but they've sort of specialized, and they're the only producer of one particular highly hazardous pesticide in the world, and they've specialized to where they do that, right? Because they had that industry there previously. So it's not that it is gone, that their industry is gone, right? And then they do a lot of sort of importing and domestic formulation and refill exporting now. So.
Have another question.
Well,
Yeah, I mean, there's, yeah. So Daniel was kind of wondering about what are the legal stops that could be either required or incentivized here. So, it was basically wondering what they can get the Trump administration to sign on to. I don't know if anything is the answer to that, but I mean, taking it in a more polycentric direction, right? Like what are some other stakeholders? Like what can the EU play a more proactive role? Are there natural alignments in other regions around the world that could lead to a more bottom up and more protections for the global South?
yes.
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
there are.
Good.
And like,
Yeah.
there's, so, for me, the antidote to this is like looking at all of the genius that is actually already in
Mhm.
producing communities, looking at what farmers are already actually doing, looking at the innovation that's happening on the ground, and supporting that.
Yeah.
So there's been a move with bilateral funders in Europe, which I have mixed feelings about in general, but towards supporting more agroecology work. Many of the foundations in the United States have been turning towards supporting more agroecology. There's been more support for farmer-led research processes, for grassroots organizing, for forms of social learning out on the farm and farmer to farmer training and learning networks to try to help people innovate out of this on the ground. Yes. Yes.
On this question, I'd be curious if these things look, so I would think it's unlikely we are going to break up large farms and go back to smaller smallholder farms. Given that that is likely the case, sort of fundamental economic transformation, I would think that the mechanisms or the points for intervention would be quite different. So for example, right, the farmer to farmer learning networks you're talking about, I would think are much more relevant on a smallholder kind of context than these larger landholders. And so it seems like there's potentially, you know, if we're thinking about from a systemic approach, right? How should we think about sort of governance of each of those kinds of interests, which are really quite different, even just within the US, at least that's my understanding, but you know, only James can correct me. But I guess I'm sort of thinking, right, like those things are really gonna vary, right, depending on the particular context, right? What kind of power does the farmer actually have to innovate in that context, right? And so I'm sort of wondering how you would think about those interventions, particularly as they might differ between smallholder and large.
James, you want to hit that one?
I think we found it surprisingly, the farmer to farmer educator, like, you know, peer education networks actually work well on the large scale farms, more so than what I think people would have given them credit for at first. And so like if you're looking at large scale monocrop, you know, corn, bean farmers, I did a project, I was on a project where we used peer-to-peer interventions as a way to get them to start to pivot towards organic production and transition to organic. And so I think having people in your neighborhood, so to say, is really important to spawn change. And they actually do work. And Purdue University, not the pharmaceutical, they've done quite a bit of work in developing those peer-to-peer networks for those larger scale grain farmers.
So just to follow up, aren't those actually their direct competitors, right? So isn't it the case then that if everybody around you is sort of sharing and essentially innovating in new areas in a way that may be at best cost equivalent to these more practices, you then are able to essentially capture the market and just being slightly right?
I don't think there's a real, there's not a, there's not, the market is not so small or tight that one or two farmers transitioning or hundreds of farmers transitioning. Like Indiana ranks like 13th out of 14 Midwest states in organic grain production. Most of our organic grains, I believe, come from like Turkey and, you know, outside the US. So I think there's plenty of room for growth, and the demand for organics has continued to increase pretty rapidly. So just because I'm farming 1,000 acres, and if I transition at all, which would be a lot to transition at once, doesn't mean I'm gonna impact, you know, what you're gonna get for your organic grains. The market's too big, and you know, a handful of farmers isn't gonna make a difference now. So I mean, I think, and part of the challenge is there's a lack of infrastructure for these farmers to transition. And so the one farmer that I know of around here in Greene County, he like had to build his own grain handling systems for it, because you have to have multiple systems. So, and it is a rail line that goes into his farm and everything like that. So it definitely takes some capital.
We're giving dissertation ideas and business ideas.
Annie's talk, sorry for jumping in, but I'm really interested in.
Thinking about your book, Annie, the book is perfect. It's already here. Like, I can totally see it.
I hope it's with Marion. And I was gonna just put this back up and be like,
that
just as a reminder,
Yeah.
all of this work, it's like not just me, I put a lot of things up there, and like all the little, like what this came from is like really tiny at the bottom. So it's wonderful to have a good team.
Idea to have the yes. So I think we really need the book. My question thinking about the book is that land appears super clearly as part of the problem. Labor, I want to ask you a question because I think definitely, of course, pesticide is a replacement for labor. But with land grabbing trends in many countries that we saw in 2008, and some of them have not gone away, maybe what we're seeing is what Tanya Lee says, the surplus population. So we need their land, but we don't need their labor. Do you think that is part of what you're seeing?
I think it really depends on where you are.
Uh-huh.
Super depends on where you are, but like in Laos, absolutely, the market wants that land for maize, even if it trashes it, right? And everybody knew, by the way, that that land was going to get trashed and be unproductive within a decade. Everybody knew that, and they did it anyway. Because the idea was you could get enough capital, maybe to get work doing something else. And there wasn't not a lot of other options, right? So absolutely, up there, the market totally wanted the land, the products from the land, and couldn't give a shit about the labor. And that, I think, is a growing trend, right? And in some ways, when we think about things like agroecology being more labor intensive, if the political economy is there to make a living doing it, that may actually be a good thing, right? And there's plenty of young people who actually, if they could make a living on their land, would rather do that, get bilked out of their wages on construction sites in 105-degree heat in the cities, sleeping in half-formed buildings. So, yeah.
Just, dreaming of the chapter on labor. Gustavo.
I want you to check that I got right your message in terms of potential policy implications. So what I got is that you're suggesting more in going in the direction of making herbicides less profitable for the individual farmers rather than going through the tradition of let's ban this stuff. So essentially, or at the very least, you are saying, let's not forget about this channel. If there is investments in technologies that do not require this stuff, these guys can, switch at very limited cost or potentially could be profitable to switch. Did I get it right?
I'm not a medical scientist, right? And I think that there are very good reasons to just straight up ban things, right? There's very good reasons for that. Like the ban on chlorpyrifos came out of 25 years of organizing and research on a long-term study that started when babies were in utero and tracking them all the way past high school in farm worker communities to look at neurodevelopmental impacts, right? And the research was great. The organizing is there. That ban was the product of a lot of labor. And in my opinion, it should be there, right? However, we've basically been playing molecular whack-a-mole, right? And there's this book called sort of Molecular Bureaucracies. There's this idea that like our regulatory system can see one molecule. That's not actually how these things work in the world, right? Like we're exposed to a million different things over and over, like just what your body does with an organophosphate depends on how hot it is, what your prior exposures were, what you've been eating. If you're anemic, right? It is very hard to standardize. Like pesticides sort of imbricate in social life in a way that's very hard to standardize. And the uncertainties are in fact high. The other part of that is farming is a really tough way to make a living. It's a very tough way to make a living, and agrochemical dependence is sort of a political and economic reality for millions and millions of producers. And so if you say, okay, we're going to ban glyphosate, right? What are we going to, if we ban glyphosate in the United States, and again, I am not qualified to make a judgment on glyphosate and non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. But if we looked at that and said, okay, that's an unacceptable risk, we're going to ban glyphosate, right? Some of the more pro-industry commentators have been like, that's a disaster because what you're going to get is older, more acutely toxic herbicides instead, because there's nothing else to replace it. And that's true, right? If you were say, okay, we're going to ban glyphosate, the sort of anti-pesticide crowd would say, well, what you're going to get is more innovation, right? Because farmers are going to have fewer options and the ban is going to spur innovation. There's evidence that that is also true. Right? What I am saying is the system that people are imbricated in sucks, right? Very technical term. That system sucks. And it doesn't have to be that way, right? And we have had so little investment in common forms of knowledge, right? So much of agriculture is process-based. So when you think about what's actually happening out there on the field, you're thinking about processes and how to intervene in those processes. A lot of agricultural innovation is just innovating process, new ways of doing things out there. And like when James is out there, be like, I'm just gonna mow, I'm not gonna spray, but I'm gonna do it at this particular timing and I'm gonna use this particular cover crop. And if I use this cover crop in this timing, it actually reduces the weed pressure for this soil type. It's real hard to commercialize that. It's real hard to commercialize that. And so we have had in the United States, this agricultural research paradigm that is deeply biased towards product, not at all supportive of process, like to a very limited degree. And those processes are basically being done by farmers out in their fields by themselves, experimenting. So like, what if we had an agricultural research infrastructure that was more focused on process, that was more focused on local knowledge, that was more focused on having communities of producers that didn't have margins that were that tight, right? That they were in debt up to their eyeballs so that you can't actually have the space to do anything different. Like, what if we had that? Right? The pesticide dependence might not be quite as terrible, right? And we might come up with many things that we've never even dreamed of that don't come in a bottle.
Fantastic.
So much again for accepting our invitation and for